The Story of the Windlenot Museum. Chapter 13. Pots and Riddles. Carl Kolchak started to head back out to the puzzle rooms and stopped. He looked back at the pot that was on the floor and said, "Should we take that pot with us? And which one is it?" He had noticed it when they first entered the room, but he never got a good look at it. He watched as Michael McNeil looked back at it as well. "Carl has a good question there, Rich. Should we take the metal Exupi pot with us as well?" He was glad the African-American boy realized which one it was. However, they were still unsure how many each of them could carry at a time. He watched as Richard Cale walked past it, looking down at it for a moment, and then continued to the door, pausing only long enough to push his glasses back onto his face. "No, we know where it is right now. If we have to leave it elsewhere because of something, we might forget where we placed it. I think that right now we need to get the items to catch the cloth Exupi, the oil Exupi, and maybe one of the two Exupi that attacked us, Mike." Carl understood the reasoning behind that thinking. As he led the way back through the puzzle rooms, he thought about how relaxing the rooms were. They were designed to help put one in a relaxed state. It made sense since the room they were returning to was one of the most unnerving in the whole museum. As they entered the Inhumanities room again, Carl suppressed a shudder as the recorded cries of agony hit his ears. Mentally, he cursed the fact that the generator was still powering the place, and part of him hoped that the power in the room would fail, just so they wouldn't hear the recording in this room anymore. As he went to head towards the door out of the room and back to the inventions room, he saw Richard climbing up the gallows display. Before he could ask what the young man was doing, he heard the lad say, "Could someone come up here and at least hold on to me as I reach for the pot?" Quickly, he and Michael both ran up and held on to Richard's legs as the boy reached for the pot. Carl couldn't help but voice his discomfort with the room. "I hope this doesn't take long. This room is more disturbing the second time around." He glanced over at Michael and could see that he wasn't the only one who felt that way. He then heard the other young man say, "He's right, Rich. Let's get out of this room quickly." He then watched as Richard managed to get out, holding the pot for the cloth Exupi without another word being said. The three of them quickly got off the gallows display and ran for the door to the room of inventions. They didn't even slow down until they reached the space room. When they all stopped for a moment, Carl looked around the room and hoped they wouldn't hear the electric Exupi again. He had not even realized they had ran to the room. Everything was the same as they had left it earlier. The flying saucer was still open, and the panel puzzle was still solved. However, he did notice that Richard was staring at the planets. As he looked at it, he remembered the riddle that Richard had told them earlier. The display in the middle might have been an attempt at a scale model of the solar system, but it was missing the outer planets. He couldn't even remember hearing about a museum that only showed the inner planets in a model of the solar system. However, he remembered what the names of the planets represented. He walked over to the model and reached for the representation of Venus. As he moved it, he told Richard, Move Mars so it aligns with Earth. It'll reveal the next riddle." He watched as Richard moved the representation of Mars. "I was just thinking that. I even remembered that the book we found earlier only seemed to focus on the inner planets. Love and war are Venus and Mars." Carl knew that, but he didn't want to say anything. It was not the first time he had been awake for several hours. The incident involving the doppelganger firebug had made both him and a famous conductor avoid falling asleep unless they were in a sacred place. When all three planets were aligned, he heard Michael shout, "That must have been it! There are some words appearing on the blue area underneath the model." He looked down, and sure enough, letters were appearing underneath it. When all the words finally appeared, he heard Michael recite them. "Midst the storm, the Norse god executes his thunderous deed. Near him a message, its contents you must heed." It must have something to do with the statue of Thor. He watched as Richard nodded. "I think you're right. We need to get down to the Gods and Legends room. I think we'll even find the top of the cloth pot down there as well." He watched as Richard looked over the pot and then said, "In fact, I think the top we found in the Anansi music box is the top for this one." He then watched as a shudder went through the boy's body. After a moment, he watched as Richard handed the cloth pot to him. "Carl, I think maybe you should have the honors of catching the cloth exupi. Neither of us was attacked by it, and maybe it would look good for you if one of us took a picture of you capturing it." After thinking about it for a moment, he took the pot, figuring that there was a second reason for Richard's choice. "Are you sure it isn't because of the mechanical spider?" When the boy remained silent, Carl just smiled. "I understand. Believe me, the events in Las Vegas were similar, except I got forced to do what I really didn't want to do." He watched as the boy nodded, and then they all went down the steps. As they made their way through the Gods and Legends room and over to the Anansi music box, he heard a familiar and disturbing sound. He glanced over to a small statue of a snake, and he noticed a green tint to it. When they were all around the music box, he quietly said, "I think I see the wax exupi hiding in the snake statue over there. Maybe we should trap that one next." He watched as the boys nodded, and then he grabbed the lid. Just the second he touched it, he watched as the lid quickly attached to the cloth pot, making a complete container. He let the shock of the moment pass quickly, and then led the mad rush back to the janitor's closet. The second he opened the door, he stopped and handed his Polaroid Instamatic to Richard. "Richard, I want you to snap the picture the second the exupi appears. If we time it right, we can get its capture on film. There is no way anyone can think the picture is doctored or faked." He watched as the boy nodded, and then stepped forward. The rags still had a green tint to them, and as he moved towards it, he heard the rustling sound. When he was close enough, he held up the pot just as the creature emerged from the rags. It was a hideous sight, with 3 apparent eyes and a slightly gaping maw. The second it saw the pot, it recoiled as if it were trying to get away. But the only place it went was right into the pot. In a few seconds, the supernatural creature was captured, and during that whole time, the only thing Carl noticed was the flash of the camera. Richard Cale lowered the camera and took a deep breath when the exupi was finally captured. The picture he had taken was still in the camera, and in a minute or so, it would show Carl catching the cloth exupi. For right now, Richard was eager to see what was hidden under the rags. He managed to get past Carl, who was still recovering from the exupi capture he had done, and moved the rags aside. As he had moved a few of them, Richard saw what was underneath. It was a lid to one of the pots, but at the moment he wasn't sure which pot it was mated with. Hopefully, he would be able to remember how the base was shaped, and when he saw it, he could remember it. He then stepped away from the rags and noticed that Carl was now placing the pot in the bag of stuff he had been carrying. Richard also noticed that Carl seemed a little more spry. as if he had been rejuvenated somehow. Carl just smiled at him. You know, in the past, I never felt this good after defeating a monster. As they left the janitor's closet, Richard shrugged, but a thought crossed his mind. Maybe some of the youth it had claimed from the others went into you. Maybe they hadn't had time to absorb it all yet. Richard wasn't sure if his thought was correct, but it could be the product of lack of rest. Standing at the entrance to the Gods and Legends room, Richard saw a concerned look on Michael's face. Before his friend could ask, Richard pulled out the photo and showed it to Michael. I think that answers the question you were about to ask. That should make 3 down and 7 to go. He watched as Michael nodded and then looked at the photo. You know, I've heard about how people analyze photos of ghosts to see if they are fake. I doubt they could do it with this one. He then saw a slight smile cross Michael's face. Heck, I might shove this photo in Kiana's face just to see her reaction. During all this, Richard could tell that Michael was starting to accept that there were things out there that could not be easily explained. As they started through the Gods and Legends room again, Richard looked about, remembering where they had found stuff so far. He slowed down for a moment as they passed the wax snake again. This time, he didn't hear a sound from it, but he also noticed it didn't have a green tint to it. In the moments they had captured the cloth exupi, the wax one had fled that hiding spot. They proceeded through the room and stopped at the shrine structure. As they looked at it, he saw Carl start heading towards it. Before he could ask why, he heard the reporter answer the unasked question. I believe now would be the right time to capture the wax exupi. Richard glanced at Michael, who only nodded. Part of him felt bad that they were trying to catch the wax exupi next, instead of the crystal exupi. But he understood why. The lid for the container was in the bowl, and the pot was in the funeral rites room, which was just 2 rooms away. He got over his concerns as Carl pulled the lid from the bowl and rejoined them. He looked at the lid and looked down, admiring the animal head on it. As they started to walk in, he looked at Michael and quietly said, Mike, we should be getting the crystal exupi first. As they neared the statue of Thor, his friend shook his head. No, the stuff for the wax exupi is closer to here. He then saw a startled look cross his friend's face, especially as Michael smacked himself in the face. Speaking of this, I think I remember seeing the oil exupi lid in the mummy case near the snake. We'll grab it once we get the wax pot. He nodded and then looked at the statue of Thor, just as Carl was looking over it as well. Michael had moved over to lean against the stone monolith that was near the statue. Now all they had to do was figure out the second riddle. He couldn't see anything that might conceal a riddle, but that didn't mean a thing. The search ended when he heard Michael yelp in surprise. He and Carl both turned and saw the stone monolith that Michael had been leaning against had spun around. What the action had revealed was another riddle, and Richard read it aloud. In hieroglyphs of Egypt ancient, a secret is concealed. Contemplate page 17. The solution is revealed. This one isn't going to be easy to solve. He watched as Michael turned to look at the inscription and read the riddle. As Michael read the riddle, Carl looked at him. What do you mean? We know where the book is. And with the water exupi gone, crossing to the book is not dangerous. Richard shook his head and as he remembered the book. His father always told him to respect books, and to that end he remembered whenever a book was vandalized. He had seen several library books vandalized. Some were ripped, others had pictures in them altered, and everyone got ingrained in his head. That was why he knew it would be pointless to go back to the book in the cave. That book was missing pages 17 and 18. And by the meaning of that riddle, our next clue is on the missing page. He then saw Michael had turned to face him, and he saw a wide smile. Well, we know the page must be in the museum here somewhere. The only people who had been in the museum was Professor Windlenot, Merrick, and Beth. We know the professor didn't have it, and I don't think Merrick had it, so before Michael could finish the statement, he heard Carl shout out the conclusion. Beth must have the missing page. We find her, and we find the missing page. He should have realized that when he was thinking about the missing page, but he didn't. Richard covered his mouth as a yawn hit him, and then shook his head to wake himself up. I think that now we should get the wax pot and catch that Exupi and the snake. I just hope he's back there. The one drawback to the plan was that the Exupi could move from hiding spot to hiding spot, as long as the spot they moved to was the material they were bound to. They quickly passed through the shaman room and entered the funeral rites room. In the brief moment that they had entered the room, Michael ran forward to the display that held the puzzle and got the wax Exupi pot. The second he gave it to Richard, Richard was amazed at how quickly and seamlessly the pot was restored. He smiled, and they all ran through the shaman room and into the gods and legends room. As they passed through the door, Richard glanced quickly to his right as he heard a sound of creaking wood. In that brief moment he could see a green tint to the wooden statue, which told him the wood Exupi was currently hiding in it. He decided not to bring that up at the moment, and they all continued to the wax snake. As they neared it, he could already see it had a greenish tint to it. He held out the wax Exupi pot in front of him and approached it. Soon he heard the sounds that it was about to attack, and then it happened. The wax Exupi oozed right out of the form of the snake and went to strike until it saw the pot. It started to recoil in fear and appeared to even try to flee. However, the pot started to suck in the Exupi like wax was flowing into the pot. Soon, the whole Exupi was back in the pot, and Richard felt the familiar feeling of his youth returning to him. When the moment passed, Richard felt a bit rejuvenated. He also felt like he could remain awake for a few more hours. Michael McNeil waited until Richard looked his normal self before he moved toward the mummy case that was propped against the wall. When they had opened it earlier, he had seen the lid and even thought he hadn't physically seen the pot. He was sure it was the lid for the oil Exupi pot. He picked up the lid and then handed it to Carl, who was a bit startled by the action. Before Carl could say anything, Michael just pointed to the lid. Carl, would you say that matches the pot in the library? He watched as Carl examined it, and then finally nodded. That's the lid. That is the lid for the oil Exupi. All we need to do now is get the oil Exupi pot, and then head to the Mysteries of the Deep room. He watched as both Carl and his rejuvenated friend nodded in agreement. He started to head back the way they had came, but he stopped when his friend said, "We need to make one stop." He turned to look at Richard, and his friend motioned to the pot he was holding. "We need to put all the pots we have in the Exupi tomb display." Michael nodded, and they started walking through all the displays. As they passed through all the displays, he started having a feeling of dread. He didn't know why, but something had spooked him in the room devoted to tombs. It hadn't bothered him when they found the passage that opened into the room near the tomb of the Exupi. As he passed through the shaman's room and into the funeral rites room, he began to think about the mural in the tombs room. Did something about the pyramid in the mural seem to bother him, as if it was something unnatural? He tried to put it out of his mind, but he couldn't fully do that, especially as they entered the tombs exhibit. As they all descended the steps and made their way over to the Exupi tomb, Michael took another glance at the mural. Again, he felt like there was something odd about the pyramid. As he looked at the mural, even though it was just a building, he had the feeling the building was looking at him. He was snapped out of the feeling when he heard Richard say, "All right, we have placed the jade exupi pot, the cloth exupi pot, and the wax exupi pot. That makes 7 in total. That means there is only 6 left, soon to be 5. He smiled a bit at Richard's optimism. In a way, it was a good sign, especially since almost half of the loose exupi were captured. However, he would feel better once they were out of the room. He glanced over at the door to the main lobby and started towards it. Well, the sooner it is 5, the sooner it could become 0, and we can get out of this museum. He heard them make sounds of agreement as they left the room. He was thankful to be out of the room, and as they went down the steps, he was glad he didn't hear the crystal exupi hiding in the chandelier. However, that meant it had to be hiding elsewhere for them to capture it. He put that out of his mind as they headed towards the library. When they entered the library, Michael ran over to the ladder and started to climb it. He heard Carl and Richard both come over to the base of the ladder, but he knew what he was after. He quickly pulled out the pot for the oil exupi and quickly got down the ladder. When he handed the pot over to Carl and watched as the two pieces became one. When that was done, they all headed out and towards the mysteries of the deep room. As they walked, he looked at the reporter and finally asked a question that was bothering him. "Carl, if you don't mind me asking, how did you get into these supernatural situations? Did you start looking for them?" He heard Carl laugh a bit, almost as if it was funny. "The honest truth is that it started back in Las Vegas. And at first, I honestly thought it had been a madman thinking he was a vampire. The more it played out, I slowly accepted it was the real deal. In the end, some influential people made it look like it was a madman, and they forced me to take care of the vampire. I'm still not able to set foot in Las Vegas, but I think some of those people are out of power." After Carl had said all that, he remembered that Carl had hinted to it earlier on. He heard a low whistle come out of his friend's mouth. "I never knew any of that, Carl. Yvette had managed to get a copy of the book about that, but she never told me any of those details. I asked my father to find a copy, but he said it was out of print." As they entered the mysteries of the deep room, he saw Carl smile a weak smile. "I can't say that I'm totally upset about that. Since the book dropped off the shelves, they haven't been trying to find me. I think they found a way to silence all the others, but I don't want to dwell on that." Michael understood what Carl was saying, especially as they reached the back of the room. Apparently, some of the stories of Las Vegas being linked to the mob and such were true. Only people that would go that far, even in Las Vegas, he was sure the story of a real-life vampire would have been viewed as a publicity stunt. Most likely, before this adventure, Michael would have viewed it as a humorous story, perfect for Halloween time. However, since his encounters with the Exupi, he no longer believed that. It unnerved him to think that creatures like that actually existed. In fact, he was going to look at horror movies a bit differently from now on. He put those thoughts out of his mind as he got to the organ, and inwardly he hoped he could concentrate on the tune. Now all he needed was to hear the tune. He looked over at Richard and Carl and said, "I think this might be a 3-person task, especially since we don't know where the door is." As the others looked around the room from the spot, he also wondered what would happen. However, he was going to be prepared, especially if he needed to step back from the organ if it moved. Soon, they would be on their way to the lowest level of the museum.